The package arrived on my doorstep like a ghost from a life I thought I had buried. September 15th, 2025. I remember the date precisely because it marked the beginning of the end of a story that had haunted 3 generations of women in my family. At 78 years old, living peacefully in my Charleston cottage, I rarely receive unexpected deliveries. My granddaughter Emma handles most of my online orders for the preserve business, and my friends know to call before visiting. So, when I found the plain brown box with no return address, addressed simply to Eleanor Catherine Mills, in careful block letters, my hands trembled as I carried it inside. The box contained tissue paper, and nestled within it was something that made my heart stop an engagement ring. Not just any ring, but one I recognized with sickening clarity. The ornate Victorian piece with intricate filigree work that had once symbolized my daughter Charlotte's happiness and my family's greatest nightmare. It was the ring Marcus Whitmore had given Charlotte when he proposed 37 years ago. The ring she had left behind when we fled Maryland in 1990, wanting no reminder of the man who had destroyed our sense of safety and trust. The ring that had belonged to his grandmother Clara, who had been my dearest childhood friend before her father's greed and violence tore our families apart forever. Beneath the ring was a note written in the same precise handwriting. Some debts pass from one generation to the next. The Whitmore family remembers what yours cost us. This ring belongs with those who understand its true meaning. The past is not finished with you yet. My legs gave way, and I sank into my kitchen chair, staring at the ring as memories crashed over me like a tide. Clara's laughter as we ran along Ocean City's beaches. The weight of Marcus pressing down on me in my own bed, his whispered words of revenge. Charlotte's face in the courtroom as she learned the truth about her husband's real identity and motivations. I had thought it was over. Marcus had died in prison 15 years ago. Clara had been gone for decades. Yet here was this ring carrying its burden of twisted history, demanding that I confront the past one final time. The phone rang, and Charlotte's familiar voice filled my kitchen. "Good morning, Mama. How are you feeling today?" I looked at the ring glinting malevolently in the morning sunlight and made a decision. "Charlotte, darling, I need you to come over. There's something I must tell you, the complete truth about Marcus Whitmore, about Clara, about why our families were bound together by hatred long before you were born. It's time you knew everything. To understand why that ring carried such power to destroy you, must first understand Ocean City, Maryland, in 1963, when I was 16 and the world still seemed full of promise rather than peril. Ocean City then was a small fishing community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where children could play unsupervised until dark, and where the biggest excitement was the annual seafood festival. My father, Daniel Mills, was a fisherman like his father before him. My mother, Rose, took in washing and made preserves to sell at the town market. We were poor, but happy, surrounded by the kind of community that modern people romanticize but rarely experience. It was the summer I turned 16 that Clara Reginald came back to town. Clara's mother had been from Ocean City originally, but she'd married above her station caught the eye of Theodore Reginald, a wealthy businessman from Baltimore who owned several factories and had interests in shipping. When Clara's mother died, giving birth to her, Theodore had taken his infant daughter back to Baltimore, wanting nothing more to do with our little town. But Clara spent summers with her maternal grandmother, Mrs. Henley, who lived in the grand house overlooking the harbor, the biggest house in Ocean City, with its own private dock and manicured gardens that required 3 full-time groundskeepers. "Eleanor Mills!" Clara called out when she spotted me at the market that first morning in June. "I was hoping you'd still be here." She was beautiful in the way that money makes possible perfect teeth, lustrous hair clothes that fit like they'd been made specifically for her body. But more than her appearance, it was her confidence that drew people to her. Clara moved through the world as if it existed solely for her pleasure. "Clara, I can't believe you remember me," I replied, though we'd been close friends during her previous summer visits. Of course I remember. You're the only person in this entire town who talks about books and ideas, instead of just fishing and gossip. We fell back into our friendship easily. Clara was 3 months older than me, but seemed years more sophisticated, full of stories about Baltimore society, her boarding school, the concerts and theater performances she attended. In return, I shared my dreams of perhaps opening a small restaurant someday, or expanding my mother's preserve business. "You're wasting your talents here, Eleanor," Clara would say as we walked the beach in the evenings. "You should come to Baltimore with me at the end of summer. Father could find you a position, maybe even help you get some education." The offer was tempting, but I was also falling in love. Daniel Harper, who was 19 to my 16, worked on one of the fishing boats and had started finding excuses to walk past our house each evening. He was handsome in a quiet way, with kind eyes and gentle hands that handled nets and fish with the same care he showed when he helped elderly Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries. "He's a nice boy," Clara observed one evening as we watched Daniel mending nets on the dock. "Very authentic. But Eleanor, you could have so much more than a fisherman's wife. In Baltimore, there are men with education with prospects." "Daniel has prospects," I protested. "He's saving money to buy his own boat eventually." Clara's laugh was like silver bells, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Oh, sweetheart, you have no idea how small those prospects really are." I should have paid more attention to that edge in her voice, but I was 16 and in love, and Clara was my dearest friend. When she suggested that we organize a town dance to raise money for new equipment for the volunteer fire department, I threw myself into the planning with enthusiasm. The dance was held in the school gymnasium on a sweltering August evening. Clara had convinced her grandmother to donate money for decorations and refreshments, and nearly the entire town turned out. I spent the evening dancing with Daniel, dizzy with happiness and the promise of young love. It was near the end of the evening that everything changed. Theodore Reginald arrived unexpectedly, driving down from Baltimore to collect Clara. I had never seen him before, but his presence filled the room like a thundercloud. He was a large man with cold eyes and an air of barely contained impatience with everything around him. "Clara, we're leaving now," he announced without preamble, not bothering to lower his voice despite the crowded room. "Father, the dance isn't over," Clara protested. "Can't we wait another hour?" I said now. His voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument. As Clara gathered her things, Theodore's gaze swept the room, taking inventory of the simple decorations, the homemade refreshments, the townspeople in their carefully pressed but clearly inexpensive clothes. When his eyes landed on me, I felt like an insect being examined by a scientist. "So you're the local girl Clara's been talking about," he said. "Eleanor Mills." "Yes, sir," I replied, though something about his tone made me want to step backwards. "Your father's the fisherman who's been asking questions about dock fees and safety regulations." I didn't know what he meant, but I nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. He works down at the harbor." Theodore's smile was like winter. Interesting. Very interesting. 3 days after the dance, my world collapsed. My father came home from the docks, white-faced and shaking. Theodore Reginald, it turned out, didn't just own factories in Baltimore. He also owned significant interests in Ocean City's fishing industry, including the dock where most of the boats operated. "He's demanding immediate payment of back fees," my father explained to my mother and me as we sat around our kitchen table. "Says we owe 3 months' worth of dock usage charges that were never mentioned before." "How much?" my mother asked quietly. "More than we make in 6 months. And Eleanor, he says if we can't pay, we're banned from using the docks. No docks, no fishing, no income." But that wasn't the worst of it. Over the following week, other families received similar demands. The Harpers, Daniel's family, the Pattersons, the Kowalskis. Every family that had been at the dance that had seen Theodore's cold assessment of our community. "It's not about the money," Daniel's father told mine when the men gathered to discuss their options. "It's about showing us our place, making sure we understand who really controls this town." The final blow came when my father tried to organize the other fishermen to contest the charges. Theodore's response was swift and brutal. My father's fishing license was revoked on a technicality, and word spread that any boat captain who hired him would face similar scrutiny of their own permits and licenses. Within a month, our family went from modest comfort to desperate poverty. With no fishing income, we couldn't afford rent on our house near the harbor. My mother's preserve business dried up when the shops that had bought from her suddenly found other suppliers who we learned later were offered better terms by Theodore's associates. We were forced to move to a tiny apartment above the hardware store, dependent on charity from neighbors who were themselves terrified of attracting Theodore's attention. I watched my proud father diminish day by day, his shoulders bowing under the weight of helplessness and shame. Clara came to see me the day before her family returned to Baltimore for the winter. Eleanor, I'm so sorry about what happened to your family, she said, though her eyes didn't meet mine. Father explained it to me. Apparently there were some misunderstandings about business matters. Misunderstandings. I stared at her in disbelief. Clara, your father destroyed my family's livelihood over dock fees that never existed before he decided to charge them. That's not how Father explains it, Clara replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. He says some people in Ocean City have been taking advantage of his generosity for years, using facilities without proper payment, spreading rumors to try to avoid their legitimate obligations. What rumors? What are you talking about? Clara's composure cracked slightly. Father says your father has been telling people that the dock operations aren't safe, that corners are being cut on maintenance to save money. Those kinds of accusations could destroy Father's reputation, hurt his business interests. I felt like I'd been slapped. Clara, my father mentioned safety concerns because he's seen equipment that needs repair procedures that put men at risk. He was trying to protect the workers. Or trying to create problems where none existed. Clara snapped, and suddenly she sounded exactly like her father. Father has invested a great deal of money in Ocean City's development. He deserves gratitude, not criticism from people who benefit from his generosity. Generosity. My voice rose, despite my efforts to stay calm. Clara, he's driven my family into poverty. He's protecting his legitimate business interests, Clara replied coldly. Eleanor, I offered to help you come to Baltimore to give you opportunities beyond this little town. You chose to stay here with your fishermen. You chose loyalty to people who don't understand how the real world works. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine sadness, mixed with something harder. I'll always remember our friendship, Eleanor. But some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. What's happened to your family is unfortunate, but it's the consequence of choices your father made. That was the last time I saw Clara Reginald. She returned to Baltimore with her father, and we heard later that she'd married well a professor named Jonathan Whitmore who taught literature at Johns Hopkins University. They had a son, Marcus, born in 1965. My family left Ocean City that winter, moving inland to a small town where my father found work in a textile mill. It wasn't the life we'd planned, but it was a life, and we rebuilt what we could from the pieces Theodore had left us. I married Daniel Harper in 1967, and Charlotte was born the following year. We made a good life together, modest but happy, and I rarely spoke about Ocean City or the Reginalds. The past was painful, and there seemed no purpose in dwelling on old injuries. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that Clara had spent her adult years telling her son a very different version of our story. In Clara's version, my father had been a troublemaker who spread malicious lies about Theodore's business practices, a man whose accusations had damaged her father's reputation and cost him valuable contracts. The Reginalds, in Clara's telling, had been the victims of a vindictive campaign by ungrateful townspeople who resented successful outsiders. Marcus Whitmore grew up believing that the Mills family had destroyed his grandfather's good name, that we owed his family a debt that could only be paid through suffering equal to what we had allegedly caused them. The ring that arrived in my kitchen 37 years later was a symbol of that twisted inheritance, a family heirloom passed down along with a legacy of lies and hatred that would nearly destroy 2 generations of women before the truth finally set us free. After leaving Ocean City, our family slowly rebuilt our lives in the small mill town of Millfield, Maryland. My father never quite recovered from the shame and helplessness of what Theodore Reginald had done to him, but he found dignity in honest work at the textile plant. My mother expanded her preserve-making, finding customers among the workers' families who appreciated quality food at fair prices. Daniel and I conducted our courtship through letters and occasional visits, our love deepening even as distance separated us. When he finally proposed in the summer of 1966, sitting beside the mill pond, where I'd learned to find peace, his words were simple and true. Eleanor, I know we don't have much to offer each other except love and the promise to work hard for whatever comes next, he said, holding my hands in his calloused ones. But if you'll have me, I swear I'll spend my life trying to deserve you. We married in September 1967 in the small Methodist church where my family had found community after leaving Ocean City. Daniel had secured work with a fishing operation in Annapolis, not quite the independent boat ownership he'd once dreamed of, but steady employment that would support a family. Charlotte was born on May 15, 1968, during a thunderstorm that knocked out power throughout the county. She arrived by candlelight perfect and healthy with Daniel's dark hair and what the midwife declared were eyes that see everything. From the moment I held her, I felt the fierce protectiveness that would define my motherhood, the absolute determination that this child would grow up safe and loved untouched by the kind of arbitrary cruelty that had shaped my own youth. She's going to be special, this one, Daniel said, stroking Charlotte's tiny fingers as she slept in my arms. Look at how she watches everything like she's taking notes for some important test. He was right. Charlotte was an unusually alert baby who grew into a precociously intelligent child. She walked early, talked early, and by the age of 3 was asking questions that left adults scrambling for answers. Mama, why do some people have everything and others have nothing? She asked one evening when she was 5, after we'd delivered preserves to a wealthy neighborhood where she'd observed the stark differences between their grand houses and our modest apartment. Life isn't always fair, sweetheart, I replied carefully. But what matters isn't what you start with, it's what you do with what you have and how you treat other people along the way. When I grow up, I'm going to make sure things are more fair, Charlotte declared with the confidence that only children possess. Daniel and I exchanged glances over her head, both proud and slightly worried about our daughter's idealistic nature. The world had not been kind to idealists in our experience, but we encouraged her dreams while trying to teach her practical wisdom. Education became our family's religion. Daniel worked overtime to save money for Charlotte's schooling, and I took in extra sewing to supplement our income. By the time Charlotte reached high school, she was consistently at the top of her class, with teachers regularly commenting on her exceptional writing ability and analytical mind. She should go to college, her English teacher Mrs. Rodriguez told us during a parent conference. I've been teaching for 20 years, and I've rarely encountered a student with Charlotte's combination of intelligence and empathy. She could do anything she sets her mind to. The thought of college expenses terrified us, but we were determined to find a way. Charlotte had earned this opportunity through her own hard work and talent. We would not let financial limitations steal her future, the way Theodore Reginald had tried to steal ours. Charlotte received a partial scholarship to the University of Maryland, where she planned to study English literature with hopes of becoming a teacher herself. The day we dropped her off at her dormitory, I felt pride and terror in equal measure. Promise me you'll be careful, I said as we hugged goodbye. College is wonderful, but it's also full of people who might not have your best interests at heart. Charlotte laughed, the sound bright and confident. Mama, I'm 18 years old, not 8. I can take care of myself. I know you can, sweetheart. Just trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I had no way of knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. Charlotte thrived in her first year, calling home weekly with stories about her classes, her professors, and her growing passion for Victorian literature. She spoke particularly enthusiastically about a professor named Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who taught a seminar on social reform novels. "He's absolutely brilliant, Mama," Charlotte gushed during one phone call. "He makes those old books come alive, shows how writers like Dickens and Gaskell were trying to change society through their stories. He says literature has the power to transform how people think about justice and social responsibility. He sounds very inspiring." I replied, though something about Charlotte's breathless admiration made me slightly uncomfortable. "How old is this professor?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe 35. But Mama age doesn't matter when you're talking about intellectual connection. He's helping me understand my own potential as a scholar." The warning bells in my mind grew louder, but I told myself I was being overprotective. Charlotte was a bright, capable young woman who deserved to explore intellectual challenges. If her professor was helping her grow academically, I should be grateful rather than suspicious. When Charlotte brought Marcus home to meet us during her junior year, my first impression was of a man who was almost too polished, too confident, too aware of his own charm. He was handsome in a conventional way, with carefully styled hair and expensive clothes that seemed designed to signal his professional success. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper, Charlotte has told me so much about you," he said, shaking Daniel's hand with exactly the right amount of firmness while offering me a smile that was perfectly calibrated between respectful and charming. During dinner, Marcus dominated the conversation with stories about his research, his publications, and his theories about literature's role in social change. He spoke knowledgeably about topics far beyond our experience, but there was something performative about his erudition, as if he were delivering a lecture rather than participating in a family conversation. "Charlotte tells me you grew up in Ocean City," he said as my mother served dessert. "That must have been idyllic, living in such a historic coastal community." "It was a good place to grow up," I replied carefully, unwilling to share our family's painful history with this stranger. "I've always been fascinated by Ocean City's development from a fishing village to a resort destination," Marcus continued. "The social dynamics must have been quite complex as the town changed. I imagine there were tensions between old families and newcomers, between traditional ways of life and modern economic pressures." His questions felt oddly specific, but I attributed his interest to academic curiosity. "Most small towns face similar challenges when they grow," I said neutrally. "Indeed. I've read some fascinating accounts of how development projects in coastal communities sometimes displaced longtime residents. It must have been difficult for families who couldn't adapt to the changes." Something in his tone, a subtle emphasis on the word displaced, made me look at him more carefully. But his expression was innocently interested, and I decided I was reading too much into casual conversation. After Marcus and Charlotte returned to college, Daniel and I discussed our impressions of our daughter's boyfriend. "He seems intelligent enough," Daniel said. "And he's obviously devoted to Charlotte. But there's something about him that I can't quite put my finger on." "I know what you mean," I agreed. "It's like he's playing a role rather than just being himself. Everything he says sounds rehearsed." "Maybe that's just how professors talk," Daniel suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The engagement announcement came during Charlotte's senior year, delivered over the phone with excitement that bubbled through the crackling long-distance connection. "Mama, Marcus proposed. He gave me his grandmother's ring. It's the most beautiful antique piece you've ever seen. We're going to be married after graduation." "Congratulations, sweetheart," I managed, though my heart was racing with unexplained anxiety. "Tell me about the proposal." "It was so romantic. He took me to dinner at this elegant restaurant in Baltimore, and during dessert he got down on one knee right there in front of everyone. He said he'd been carrying his grandmother's ring for months, waiting for the right moment to ask me to be his wife." "His grandmother's ring?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why that detail caught my attention. "Yes, it belonged to Clara Whitmore. That was his grandmother's name after she married. Marcus says she was from a prominent family on the Eastern Shore originally, but they moved to Baltimore when she was young. The ring has been passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore women." Clara. The name hit me like a physical blow, though I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Clara was a common name, and there were many prominent families on the Eastern Shore. What was her maiden name? I heard myself ask, though part of me already knew the answer. Reginald, I think. Clara Reginald Whitmore. Why do you ask? The room seemed to spin around me as the pieces clicked into place. Marcus Whitmore was Clara's grandson. The woman who had been my dearest childhood friend, who had stood by while her father destroyed my family, who had blamed us for her father's own cruelty, that Clara had raised a son who had in turn raised Marcus. And Marcus was marrying my daughter. Mama, are you there? You got very quiet. I'm here, sweetheart, I managed. I'm just surprised. It's a small world, that's all. But even as I spoke, I knew this was no coincidence. Somehow, someway Marcus had sought out Charlotte deliberately. The question was why and what he intended to do now that he was positioned at the heart of our family. The ring that would arrive in my kitchen decades later was the same ring Marcus had used to seal his engagement to Charlotte. Clara's ring passed down, along with Clara's version of our family's history, along with a twisted desire for revenge that had been festering for 2 generations. But I didn't understand any of that yet. All I knew was that my daughter was engaged to the grandson of the woman who had helped destroy my childhood, and that I had no way to warn Charlotte without sounding paranoid or vindictive. The trap had been set years before Charlotte was even born, and now it was closing around us with the inexorable precision of a machine designed for destruction. Planning Charlotte's wedding became an exercise in suppressing my growing anxiety while maintaining the facade of a happy mother of the bride. Every conversation with Marcus felt like a chess match where I couldn't see the board clearly, where his casual questions about our family history seemed to probe for information I didn't understand he was seeking. Charlotte mentioned that your family used to live in Ocean City, he said one afternoon as we discussed wedding arrangements in my living room. I've always found it fascinating how coastal communities evolved during the mid-20th century development boom. What made your family decide to leave? Economic opportunities, I replied carefully. My father found better work inland. Of course, I imagine the fishing industry was quite volatile in those days, especially for families without significant capital investment. He paused, seeming to consider his words. I've read that there were often conflicts between established business interests and smaller operators who couldn't adapt to changing market conditions. There was something in his tone, a subtle implication that my father had been somehow inadequate or inflexible, that made my temper flare. But Charlotte was sitting beside him, glowing with happiness, and I bit back the sharp response I wanted to make. My father was an excellent fisherman, I said instead. He understood the sea and respected it. Sometimes that's not enough when you're dealing with people who see everything in terms of profit margins. Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Indeed, business can be quite ruthless, especially when established interests feel threatened by, let's call them, external pressures. The conversation left me feeling manipulated and off balance, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Marcus had said nothing obviously offensive, but every word seemed designed to provoke a reaction, to test my knowledge or gauge my responses to specific topics. Daniel noticed my discomfort, but attributed it to normal pre-wedding stress. You're overthinking things, Eleanor, he said when I tried to explain my concerns. The man loves Charlotte, and she loves him. Whatever family history there might be between the Reginalds and us, it was a long time ago. Marcus probably doesn't even know the details. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus knew exactly what had happened between our families, and that he cared about it far more than a casual academic interest would explain. The wedding took place on a perfect June morning in 1989, with Charlotte radiant in her grandmother's altered dress, and Marcus playing the role of devoted groom with apparent sincerity. As I watched them exchange vows in the small church where Daniel and I had been married, I tried to focus on Charlotte's happiness rather than my own misgivings. During the reception held in our backyard under strings of lights that Daniel had hung between the trees, I found myself observing Marcus more carefully than a mother-in-law should. He was charming and attentive to Charlotte, respectful to our older relatives, appropriately grateful for the modest celebration we had managed on our limited budget. But several times throughout the evening, I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Not hostile, exactly, but calculating, as if he were taking mental notes about something only he understood. The moment that crystallized my unease came near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and only family remained to help clean up. Charlotte was in the house, changing out of her wedding dress, and Marcus approached me as I gathered dishes from the abandoned tables.
"Mrs. Harper, I want to thank you for welcoming me into your family,"
he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed odd given the intimate setting. "Of course, Marcus. Charlotte loves you, which makes you our son now."
"That's very generous of you," he replied, "especially considering our family's complicated history."
I froze, a stack of plates balanced in my hands. "What do you mean by complicated history?" Marcus's smile was perfectly pleasant, but there was something predatory in his eyes. "Oh, just the usual small-town dynamics. Ocean City in the 1960s was such a fascinating case study in how development pressure affected traditional communities. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the social tensions of that era."
"What kinds of stories?" I asked, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears.
"Nothing specific, really. Just observations about how some families handled change better than others, how some people adapted to new realities while others clung to outdated ways of thinking." He paused, studying my face carefully. "She always said the Mills family was particularly interesting in their approach to modernization efforts." The plates slipped from my hands, shattering on the patio stones with a crash that brought Daniel running from the house.
"Eleanor, are you all right?" he asked, kneeling beside me as I stared at the broken pieces scattered at my feet. "I'm fine," I managed. "Just clumsy."
But as Daniel helped me clean up the shards, I was acutely aware of Marcus watching us with that same calculating expression, as if my reaction had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. Charlotte and Marcus left for their honeymoon in Europe the next morning, and I spent the following days trying to convince myself that I had misinterpreted Marcus's comments. Perhaps he really had meant nothing more than academic curiosity about small-town development patterns. Perhaps my own painful memories were making me read malice into innocent observations. When they returned 3 weeks later, Marcus seemed like a different person, warmer, more natural, genuinely affectionate with Charlotte, and appropriately friendly with Daniel and me. I began to think my wedding night anxiety had been the product of stress and overactive imagination. The newlyweds settled into their life in Baltimore, where Marcus continued teaching, and Charlotte began working as a substitute teacher while applying for full-time positions. They visited us monthly, and their marriage appeared happy and stable. Marcus was attentive to Charlotte's needs, supportive of her career goals, and appropriately respectful of her family relationships. But there were moments, brief flashes that might have been nothing, when I caught glimpses of something else beneath his careful facade. The way his jaw tightened when Charlotte mentioned plans that didn't include him. The subtle corrections he made to her stories, small adjustments that positioned him as more central to events than her original version suggested. The questions he asked about our family history that seemed innocuous individually, but formed a pattern I couldn't quite identify. "Charlotte seems so happy," I told Daniel after one of their visits. "But I can't shake the feeling that Marcus is managing her somehow, shaping her responses, controlling the information flow."
"She's a newlywed, Eleanor. Of course she defers to her husband on some things. That's normal adjustment to marriage. But it's not like Charlotte to be so careful about what she says. She used to tell us everything, share every detail of her life. Now it's like she's editing herself, making sure her stories match some approved version."
Daniel squeezed my hand reassuringly. "You raised an independent, intelligent daughter. Trust her to handle her own marriage. If there are problems, she'll figure them out." His confidence proved tragically misplaced. Charlotte was intelligent, but Marcus was playing a game she didn't even know existed, following rules he had learned from his grandmother's twisted version of history. The crisis came 8 months after the wedding, when Daniel suffered the heart attack that would leave me a widow at 41 and vulnerable to the revenge Marcus had been planning since childhood.
Daniel collapsed while working in our garden on a Saturday morning in February 1990, clutching his chest and gasping words I couldn't understand. The ambulance arrived within minutes of my frantic phone call, but it was already too late. My husband, my partner, my anchor in the world was gone before we reached the hospital. Charlotte and Marcus drove down from Baltimore as soon as they received my call arriving, while I was still sitting in the hospital waiting room, unable to process the reality of Daniel's death. Charlotte held me while I cried her own tears mixing with mine as we mourned the man who had loved us both so completely. Marcus was solicitous and helpful during those terrible first days handling funeral arrangements and paperwork, while Charlotte and I struggled with our grief. He seemed genuinely moved by Daniel's death, speaking eloquently at the service about the kind of quiet integrity that Daniel had embodied. He was the kind of man who made the world better simply by being in it, Marcus said during his eulogy. His love for Eleanor and Charlotte was evident to anyone who spent time with this family, and his legacy lives on in the strength and character of the women he leaves behind. At the time, I was grateful for Marcus's support and touched by his obvious affection for Daniel. Only later would I understand that he was positioning himself as the grieving family's protector and supporter, establishing the trust he would need for the final phase of his revenge. The ring that had sealed his engagement to my daughter was about to become the instrument of my destruction, carrying with it all the hatred and lies that Clara had passed down to her grandson like a poisonous inheritance. But first, Marcus needed me isolated and vulnerable, cut off from the support systems that might have protected me from what he was planning. Daniel's death had given him the opportunity he'd been waiting for, and he intended to make the most of it. In the weeks following Daniel's funeral, Marcus became a model son-in-law. He called regularly to check on me, helped with insurance paperwork and estate matters, and gently encouraged Charlotte to spend weekends at home so I wouldn't be alone with my grief. "Your mother shouldn't be isolated right now," I overheard him telling Charlotte during one of these calls. "Grief can be dangerous when people have too much time to dwell on their loss. We need to make sure she stays connected to family." His concern seemed genuine, and I was touched by his thoughtfulness. The elaborate theories I had constructed about his motives seemed paranoid and unfair in light of his obvious care for my well-being. It was during one of their March visits that Marcus first mentioned his interest in our family's Ocean City history. "I've been researching coastal development patterns for a paper I'm writing," he said as we sat in my living room after dinner. "Ocean City keeps coming up as an interesting case study in how traditional communities adapted or failed to adapt to economic modernization." "It was a long time ago," I replied, still reluctant to revisit painful memories. "Of course, but institutional memory is so valuable for understanding broader social patterns. For instance, I've found records suggesting there were significant conflicts between established business interests and local fishermen during the 1960s development boom." Charlotte looked up from the book she was reading. "Mama never talks much about Ocean City. I know they lived there when she was young, but something happened that made the family leave. Economic displacement was quite common during that period." Marcus said, his voice carrying academic detachment that somehow made his next words more chilling. "Development projects often required reorganization of existing social structures. Families who couldn't adapt to new realities sometimes found themselves marginalized." "What do you mean by couldn't adapt?" I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, but somehow predatory. "Well, from what I've read, there were cases where longtime residents resented successful businessmen who invested in community development. Sometimes they spread rumors or made accusations designed to undermine legitimate business operations." "That's a very sanitized way to describe what actually happened," I said, my voice sharper than I had intended. "Oh." Marcus tilted his head with apparent interest. "You have personal knowledge of these events?" I realized I had walked into a trap, but it was too late to retreat without seeming evasive. "My father was one of the fishermen who lost his livelihood when certain business interests decided to reorganize the harbor operations." "How unfortunate." I suppose there are always different perspectives on complex business situations. What was your father's version of events? The question sounded innocent, but there was something in Marcus's tone that made me feel like a specimen being studied. Charlotte had put down her book and was listening intently, clearly curious about family history I had never shared with her. My father believed that some people used their economic power to force out families who had lived and worked in Ocean City for generations. I said carefully. There were irregularities in how dock fees and licenses were handled, practices that made it impossible for independent fishermen to continue operating. That must have been very frustrating for him, Marcus replied with apparent sympathy. I imagine it would be natural to look for someone to blame when circumstances change beyond one's control. It wasn't about blame, I said, my temper beginning to flare despite my efforts to stay calm. It was about documented abuse of power by people who saw our community as nothing more than an obstacle to their profit margins. Documented. Marcus's eyebrows rose with polite skepticism. That's interesting. Most of the official records I've seen suggest that the development projects were conducted according to standard business practices, with appropriate compensation for any legitimate disruptions. Appropriate compensation. I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice now. Families who had lived in Ocean City for generations were driven into poverty, forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods. If that's what you call appropriate compensation, then I suppose we have very different definitions of justice. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering my perspective with academic objectivity. It's fascinating how different people can interpret the same events in such contrasting ways. I imagine the business families involved would describe their actions quite differently, as necessary steps to modernize an economically stagnant community perhaps, or as reasonable responses to unfair criticism of their legitimate investments. The business families? I repeated slowly, a chill running down my spine as I began to understand what was happening. Which business families specifically? Marcus's smile was perfectly pleasant, but his eyes had gone cold. Oh, I don't remember all the names from my research. The Reginalds were mentioned prominently, of course. Theodore Reginald seems to have been quite influential in Ocean City's development during that period. Charlotte looked between Marcus and me with growing confusion. Who was Theodore Reginald? And what does this have to do with our family? Before I could answer, Marcus continued with the same academic tone that somehow made his words more menacing. Theodore Reginald was quite a successful businessman, shipping, manufacturing, various investments. He had a daughter named Clara, who married into another prominent Baltimore family. It's quite a compelling story, actually, about how dedicated businessmen built modern prosperity from traditional fishing communities. That's not how it happened, I whispered, finally understanding the full scope of what Marcus had been planning. No. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying my face with evident satisfaction. How would you describe it then, Mrs. Harper? From your family's perspective? The room seemed to be spinning around me as all the pieces clicked into place. Marcus wasn't just academically interested in Ocean City's development. He was Theodore Reginald's great-grandson, Clara's grandson, raised on her distorted version of events and determined to extract revenge for wrongs that existed only in his family's mythology. And I had let him marry my daughter. I had welcomed him into our home, allowed him to position himself at the center of our family's life, given him access to everything I loved most in the world. Charlotte, I said, my voice barely audible, I think you should know something about your husband's family history. But even as I spoke, I could see Marcus's confident expression and realized that he had already prepared for this moment. Whatever version of events he had told Charlotte, whatever lies he had constructed to explain our family's connection, he was ready for my accusations. The trap had been closing around me for months, and now I was about to discover just how completely he had isolated me from my daughter's trust and love. The ring that had sealed their engagement was about to become the symbol of my destruction, and there was nothing I could do to stop what was coming.
Marcus's revelation about his family connection hung in the air like poison gas, changing everything about our conversation and my understanding of the danger I was in. Charlotte looked between us with growing alarm, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. "Mama, what's going on?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way I have," I replied, never taking my eyes off Marcus. "Your husband is Theodore Reginald's great-grandson, Charlotte. Clara Reginald was his grandmother." Charlotte's face went blank with confusion. "Who is Clara Reginald, and why does that matter?" Marcus answered before I could, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex concept to a slow student. "Clara Reginald was a remarkable woman who overcame tremendous adversity, darling. Her family was driven out of Ocean City by malicious rumors spread by people who resented their success." "That's not true," I said sharply. "Clara's father destroyed my family." "According to whom?" Marcus interrupted smoothly. "According to your father, who was facing bankruptcy due to his own poor business decisions, according to fishermen who refused to adapt to modern harbor management practices and then blamed others for their failures." Charlotte looked at me with uncertainty that broke my heart. "Mama, I don't understand what you're talking about. What happened in Ocean City?" I took a deep breath and began to tell her the truth about Theodore Reginald's systematic destruction of our family and community, about the arbitrary fees and revoked licenses, about the way powerful interests had used their economic leverage to crush anyone who questioned their methods. But as I spoke, I could see Marcus nodding sadly, as if my words confirmed something tragic he had already explained to Charlotte. "Sweetheart," he said gently when I finished, "this is exactly what my grandmother warned me might happen. She said that some families never recovered from the shame of what they did in Ocean City, that they spent decades creating elaborate justifications for their actions." "What we did?" I stared at him in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's expression grew somber, as if he were reluctantly sharing painful family history. "My grandmother spent her final years trying to rebuild the reputation that Eleanor's father destroyed with his false accusations. She died in a car accident driving through a storm because she was too ashamed to stay in Baltimore, where everyone knew the story of how the Mills family had slandered her father's good name." "That's insane," I said, my voice rising. "Your great-grandfather was a criminal who—" "Mama." Charlotte's voice was sharp with warning. "Marcus's grandmother died in an accident. You're talking about his family." I realized with growing horror that Marcus had already poisoned Charlotte against me, had prepared her to interpret my accusations as evidence of mental instability or vindictive jealousy. He had spent months positioning himself as the rational, caring husband, while subtly undermining my credibility with my own daughter. "Charlotte, you have to listen to me," I pleaded. "Marcus didn't marry you because he loved you. He sought you out deliberately as part of some twisted plan for revenge." "Stop it!" Charlotte stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mama, I don't know what's gotten into you, but I won't let you attack my husband with these horrible accusations." Marcus reached for Charlotte's hand with exactly the right expression of hurt bewilderment. "It's all right, darling. Your mother is grieving, and grief can sometimes create elaborate explanations for old pain." "Don't you dare patronize me!" I snarled, finally allowing my own anger to show. "And don't you dare use my grief as an excuse for your lies." "Eleanor," Marcus said quietly, "I think you need professional help. This level of paranoia and hostility isn't healthy, especially so soon after losing Daniel." Charlotte was nodding, tears streaming down her face as she looked at me with a mixture of love and pity that made me want to scream. "Mama, Marcus is right. You haven't been yourself since Daddy died. Maybe you should talk to someone, get some help processing your grief." "I don't need help processing grief." I replied desperately. I need you to understand that your husband is lying to you, that everything about your marriage is built on deception and revenge. But even as I spoke, I could see that I was only confirming Marcus's narrative about my mental state. Every word of truth I spoke was being interpreted as evidence of delusion, every expression of urgency as proof of instability. Marcus stood and put his arm around Charlotte protectively. I think we should go back to Baltimore tonight, he said gently. Give Eleanor some time to calm down. Maybe reconsider seeking professional support. No, I said, panic rising in my throat. Charlotte, please don't leave with him. Please stay here tonight so we can talk about this rationally. Mama, you're scaring me, Charlotte replied, backing toward the door with Marcus. I love you, but I won't let you destroy my marriage with these paranoid fantasies. They left within the hour, Charlotte hugging me stiffly, while Marcus watched with an expression of satisfied concern. As their car pulled out of my driveway, I understood that I had lost my daughter completely. Marcus had maneuvered me into exactly the position he wanted, isolated, discredited, and helpless to prevent whatever he was planning next. That night, I sat in my empty house and tried to think of anyone who might believe my story about Marcus's true identity and motives. But who would take the word of a recently widowed woman against that of a respected professor? Who would believe that a successful academic had built his entire adult life around seeking revenge for events that had occurred before he was born? I was still sitting at my kitchen table when Marcus returned alone at midnight, letting himself in through the back door with a key Charlotte must have given him. Hello, Eleanor, he said conversationally, as if his presence in my house at midnight were perfectly normal. I hope you've had time to think about our conversation this evening. Get out of my house, I whispered, though fear had frozen me in my chair. Oh, I don't think so, Marcus replied, settling himself comfortably across from me. We have unfinished business, you and I, debts that have been accumulating interest for 30 years. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bottle of wine, placing it on the table between us with ceremonial precision. This is very special wine, he said, opening the bottle with practiced ease. It belonged to my grandmother, Clara. She saved it for a special occasion that never came during her lifetime, but I think tonight qualifies as special, don't you? I tried to stand to run to do anything except sit there watching him pour wine into 2 glasses with the careful attention of someone performing a ritual. You see, Eleanor, my grandmother spent her final years telling me stories about Ocean City, about the friendship she thought she had with a girl named Eleanor Mills. She never understood why that friendship ended so badly, why the Mills family chose to destroy her father's reputation rather than accept the generous opportunities he offered them. That's not what happened, I managed to say, though my voice was barely audible. Isn't it? Marcus smiled, pushing one of the wine glasses toward me. Let me tell you what my grandmother remembered, and you can tell me if any of it sounds familiar. He began to speak in a hypnotic storytelling voice that made it impossible to look away from his face. Impossible to think clearly about anything except the words he was weaving around me like chains. Clara's version of events, as Marcus related it, painted Theodore Reginald as a visionary businessman who had tried to modernize Ocean City for everyone's benefit. The Mills family, in her telling, had been troublemakers who spread malicious rumors about safety violations and corrupt practices undermining Theodore's legitimate business operations out of jealousy and spite. When my great-grandfather tried to address the problems these rumors were creating, your father became violent and threatening. Marcus continued. The dock incident wasn't an accident caused by poor safety practices. It was the result of your father's own reckless behavior while he was intoxicated. Stop lying, I whispered, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Clara was heartbroken when she realized that her best friend's family had been spreading lies about her father. She tried to maintain the friendship, tried to help Eleanor understand that the Mills family's accusations were hurting innocent people. But Eleanor chose loyalty to her family's lies over truth and friendship. Marcus reached across the table and touched my hand with fingers that felt like ice. Clara never recovered from that betrayal, Eleanor.
She spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild her father's reputation, trying to understand how people she had trusted could be so cruel and vindictive. The wine glass was somehow in my hand now, though I couldn't remember picking it up. The liquid inside was dark red and seemed to swirl with its own motion, hypnotic and somehow alive. "Drink with me, Eleanor," Marcus said softly. "Let's toast to justice finally being served, to debts finally being paid." I knew I shouldn't drink the wine, knew that something was terribly wrong with this entire situation. But Marcus's voice was so reasonable, so persuasive, and I was so tired of fighting against forces I didn't understand. The wine tasted bitter with an aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly on my tongue. But Marcus was smiling encouragingly, raising his own glass in a toast to something I couldn't quite remember. "That's right, Eleanor. Just relax. Let yourself finally understand what justice feels like." The room began to spin around me, and Marcus's face seemed to blur and shift like something seen through water. I tried to stand, tried to call for help, but my body wouldn't obey my commands. "Don't fight it," Marcus whispered, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "This is what you owe my family, Eleanor. This is payment for what your lies cost us." The last thing I remembered clearly was Marcus lifting me from my chair, his arms around me in a mockery of tenderness, as consciousness faded and the nightmare began. I awakened to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window and pain that radiated through every inch of my body. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why everything hurt so terribly. Then awareness crashed over me like a cold wave, and I understood with sickening clarity what had been done to me. Marcus was gone, of course. The house felt empty and violated, filled with the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. I lay in my bed, the bed I had shared with Daniel for 20 years, and tried to process the reality that my daughter's husband had drugged and raped me in my own home. The physical evidence was undeniable. Blood on the sheets, bruises on my thighs and arms, the burning pain between my legs that made it agony to move. But worse than the physical trauma was the knowledge that this had been planned, that Marcus's entire relationship with Charlotte had been designed to position him for this moment of revenge. I tried to get up and immediately fell back onto the bed as nausea overwhelmed me. Whatever Marcus had put in the wine was still affecting my system, making it difficult to think clearly or coordinate my movements. But gradually, through the fog of drugs and trauma, I began to understand the full scope of what he had accomplished. He had discredited me with Charlotte before attacking me, ensuring that any accusations I made would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a grieving widow. He had isolated me from my daughter's support and love, leaving me with no one to turn to who would believe my story. And he had violated me in the most intimate way possible, demonstrating his power to destroy everything I held sacred. The phone rang repeatedly throughout that first day, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it. Charlotte's voice echoed from the answering machine, apologetic and concerned about our argument the previous evening, hoping we could work things out when I was feeling more rational. "Mama, Marcus and I both love you," she said during one message. "We want to help you through this difficult time, but you have to be willing to accept that help. Please call me back when you're ready to talk sensibly." The word sensibly broke something inside me. Marcus had maneuvered the situation so perfectly that even my own daughter believed his version of events, believed that I was the irrational one who needed professional help. By evening, I had managed to shower and change clothes, though every movement was still painful. I sat in my living room, surrounded by photographs of Daniel and Charlotte, and tried to decide what to do next. Calling the police seemed futile. What evidence did I have beyond my own testimony? Marcus was a respected professor with no criminal record, while I was a recently widowed woman who had just publicly accused him of elaborate conspiracy theories. Any investigation would quickly focus on my mental state rather than his actions. But I couldn't let him return to Charlotte as if nothing had happened. I couldn't allow him to continue his charade of loving husband
while plotting whatever additional revenge he had planned for our family. The decision to tell Charlotte everything, despite the almost certain consequences, came from desperation rather than hope. Even if she didn't believe me, even if it destroyed our relationship forever, she needed to know the truth about the man she had married. I called her the next morning, my voice still hoarse from the previous night's trauma. "Mama, I'm so glad you called," Charlotte said, relief evident in her tone. "I was worried about you after the way we left things." "Charlotte, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the entire story before you respond." Of course. But first I owe you an apology. Marcus helped me understand that you're dealing with complicated grief, and I should have been more patient with your concerns about his family history. The fact that Marcus had already begun shaping her response to my accusations filled me with despair, but I pressed on. "Sweetheart, Marcus came back to the house after you left. He drugged me and sexually assaulted me. This wasn't random violence. It was planned revenge for what he believes my family did to his grandmother's reputation." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if Charlotte had hung up. "Mama," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "That's a very serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain about what you think happened?" "I'm certain about what I know happened," I replied firmly. "Marcus admitted that he sought you out deliberately, that our entire family history was researched and planned. He's not the man you think you married, Charlotte. Mama, Marcus was with me all night. He came home upset about your accusations, worried about your mental state. We talked until nearly dawn about how to get you appropriate help." The lie was delivered so smoothly that for a moment I doubted my own memories. But the pain in my body was real. The violation was real, and Marcus's confession about his grandmother was real. "He's lying to you, Charlotte. He left after you did and didn't return until morning. Check with your neighbors. If you don't believe me, ask if they saw his car in the driveway overnight." "I don't need to check with neighbors," Charlotte replied, her voice growing colder. "I need you to check yourself into a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. These delusions are getting worse, and I'm afraid of what you might do if you don't get professional help." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Charlotte becoming increasingly convinced that I was having some kind of breakdown, while I became increasingly desperate to make her understand the truth. We ended up shouting at each other, both of us in tears, before Charlotte hung up with a promise to do whatever necessary to get me the help I clearly needed. Within hours, I received a call from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist Charlotte had contacted on Marcus's recommendation. Dr. Mitchell explained that my family was concerned about my mental health and suggested that I come in for an evaluation to rule out any serious psychological issues related to my recent bereavement. The call made it clear that Marcus's campaign to discredit me was accelerating. He was using Charlotte's love and concern for me as weapons, turning her into an unwitting accomplice in his efforts to have me committed or otherwise silenced. That night, alone in my violated house, I made a decision that would determine the course of everything that followed. I would not allow Marcus to destroy me the way his great-grandfather had destroyed my father. I would not disappear quietly into psychiatric treatment or surrender to the isolation he was trying to impose. I would fight back with the only weapons I had: the truth about what had really happened in Ocean City, documented evidence that Marcus's family mythology was built on lies, and my own determination to protect Charlotte from the monster she had married. The ring that had sealed their engagement was about to become evidence in a case that would expose 3 generations of lies and finally deliver the justice that had been denied to my family for 30 years. But first, I had to survive long enough to gather that evidence and find someone willing to listen to the truth. The next few days passed in a haze of pain and determination as I began to understand that I was fighting not just for my own credibility, but for Charlotte's safety and future. Marcus had demonstrated that he was capable of meticulous planning and brutal violence, and I had no reason to believe his campaign of revenge was complete. My first step was to document everything I could remember about his confession and assault. I wrote down every detail, every word he had spoken about Clara and Theodore Reginald, every aspect of how he had orchestrated the evening's events. The act of writing helped me process what had happened while creating a record that might be useful later. Then I began researching Marcus's family history using the limited resources available to me in pre-internet 1990. I drove to the county courthouse and the local newspaper archives looking for any documentation of the events in Ocean City that might support my version of what had happened. What I found was both vindicating and terrifying. The courthouse records included testimony from the brief investigation that had followed my father's dock accident testimony, that confirmed Daniel's observations about safety violations and deliberate sabotage. Multiple witnesses had reported seeing Theodore Reginald's employees tampering with equipment shortly before the accident that ended my father's career. The newspaper archives were even more revealing. Articles from the mid-1960s described a pattern of harassment and intimidation directed at Ocean City fishing families who had questioned harbor management practices. The coverage was circumspect, probably due to Theodore's influence with publishers, but the facts were there for anyone willing to look carefully. Most importantly, I found Clara's obituary from 1978, which mentioned that she had been preceded in death by her husband Jonathan Whitmore and survived by her son Marcus Whitmore, age 13. The dates and relationships matched Marcus's story, confirming that he was indeed Clara's grandson and had been raised by her after his parents' deaths. But the obituary also contained information that Marcus hadn't shared. Clara had spent her final years in and out of psychiatric treatment, suffering from what the euphemistic language of the era described as nervous exhaustion and melancholia. The woman who had raised Marcus and filled his head with stories about our family's supposed crimes had been mentally ill, her perceptions distorted by grief and instability. Armed with this documentation, I made an appointment with Detective Robert Chen of the County Sheriff's Department. Detective Chen was a patient man with intelligent eyes who listened to my story without interruption, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that suggested he was taking my accusations seriously. "Mrs. Harper, these are very serious allegations," he said when I finished recounting Marcus's assault and confession. "Before we proceed, I need to ask, have you sought medical attention for the injuries you described?" "I was too ashamed," I admitted, "and too afraid that no one would believe me. We need medical documentation if we're going to build a case," Detective Chen explained gently. "I understand this is difficult, but physical evidence is crucial for prosecution." The medical examination was humiliating but necessary. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the physician who examined me, was professional and compassionate, documenting injuries that were consistent with sexual assault while explaining that the passage of time had eliminated some potential evidence. "The trauma patterns are definitive," Dr. Warren told Detective Chen when she submitted her report. "Mrs. Harper was definitely the victim of a violent sexual assault, and the time frame she's describing is consistent with the healing stages of her injuries." With medical evidence supporting my accusations, Detective Chen began investigating Marcus's background and movements. What he discovered added disturbing new dimensions to the case. Marcus had been taking unexplained leaves of absence from his teaching position, supposedly for research trips that had no academic documentation. His financial records showed payments to private investigators and unusual cash withdrawals that suggested he had been funding activities he wanted to keep secret. Most chilling was the discovery of a storage unit Marcus had rented under a false name filled with materials related to my family and Ocean City. Photographs of our house, copies of newspaper clippings about the 1960s development controversy, maps with our address clearly marked the evidence of stalking and obsessive planning was overwhelming. But the storage unit also contained Clara's personal papers, including her journal from the final years of her life. Reading those pages was like looking into the mind of someone whose grip on reality had been slowly eroding under the weight of grief and mental illness. Clara's journal revealed that she had never accepted the truth about her father's business practices, instead constructing an elaborate fantasy in which the Mills family were villains who had destroyed innocent people out of jealousy and spite. She had spent decades nurturing this delusion, feeding it with selective memories
and paranoid interpretations of subsequent events. Most disturbing were the entries from Marcus's childhood, which showed how Clara had systematically indoctrinated him with her twisted version of history. She had made him promise to restore the family honor and make the Mills family pay for their crimes. She had turned a child into a weapon of revenge against people who had never wronged her. "This explains a lot about your son-in-law's behavior," Detective Chen told me after reviewing Clara's journal. "He's been programmed since childhood to believe that your family destroyed his, and he's spent his adult life planning revenge for crimes that existed only in his grandmother's delusions." The investigation expanded as other evidence emerged. A search of Marcus's apartment revealed additional documentation of his obsession with our family, including a detailed timeline of Charlotte's life and photographs that had clearly been taken without her knowledge. Detective Chen also discovered that Marcus had been in contact with other members of Clara's extended family people, who shared her distorted understanding of the Ocean City events and supported his quest for revenge. The conspiracy was larger and more organized than I had realized, involving multiple people who had been raised on the same lies that had motivated Marcus. "We're going to arrest him," Detective Chen told me after weeks of investigation. "The evidence is overwhelming assault, stalking, fraud, conspiracy. He's going away for a long time, Mrs. Harper." But even as I felt relief at the prospect of justice, I knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Charlotte still believed Marcus's lies about me, still thought I was suffering from psychiatric delusions. Convincing her of the truth would require more than police evidence. It would require her to accept that her entire marriage had been built on deception and hatred. The arrest took place on a Thursday morning in May, as Marcus was arriving for his first class of the day. Students and faculty watched in shock as he was led away in handcuffs. The respected professor revealed as a criminal who had built his entire adult life around seeking revenge for imaginary wrongs. Charlotte called me within hours, her voice shaking with disbelief and anger. "They arrested Marcus at the university, Mama, in front of everyone, like he was some kind of dangerous criminal. What did you tell them? What lies did you make up to destroy his career?" "I told them the truth, sweetheart. About what he did to me, about what he confessed, about the evidence they found in his storage unit. There is no evidence because nothing happened," Charlotte screamed into the phone. "You've destroyed an innocent man because you can't handle your own grief." The conversation ended with Charlotte hanging up on me, and I understood that Marcus had succeeded in one crucial part of his revenge. He had turned my own daughter against me, probably permanently. But as I would discover during the trial that followed, truth has a power that transcends even the most carefully constructed lies. The evidence of Marcus's crimes was too overwhelming to dismiss, the documentation of his family's delusions too comprehensive to ignore. The ring that had started this nightmare would finally become the symbol of justice, rather than revenge, proof that some debts can only be paid through honesty rather than hatred. Marcus's trial began 6 months after his arrest in a courthouse packed with media representatives who had been following what they called the professor's revenge case. The story had captured public attention because it combined elements that people found both fascinating and horrifying: academic respectability, hiding criminal obsession, family secrets spanning generations, and the question of how childhood indoctrination could create adult monsters. Charlotte sat in the front row throughout the proceedings, still convinced of Marcus's innocence despite the mounting evidence against him. She had hired an expensive defense attorney, Nathan Cross, who specialized in cases involving mental health issues and family trauma. District Attorney Patricia Morrison, who was prosecuting the case, had warned me that Cross would try to portray me as an unreliable narrator, whose grief and possible mental illness had created false memories of events that never occurred. "He's going to argue that you seduced Marcus and then fabricated the rape accusation when he rejected you," DA Morrison explained during one of our preparation sessions. "It's a despicable defense strategy, but it's often effective with juries who don't want to believe that seemingly respectable people are capable of such elaborate deception." The prosecution's opening statement was methodical and devastating. D.A. Morrison laid out the timeline of Marcus's deception from his childhood indoctrination by Clara through his calculated pursuit of Charlotte and culminating in his assault on me. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she said, this case is about a man who spent his entire adult life planning revenge against a family for crimes they never committed. The defendant didn't just commit rape, he committed fraud, stalking, and conspiracy, all in service of a twisted quest for justice based on his mentally ill grandmother's delusions. Cross's opening statement painted a very different picture. He described Marcus as a dedicated scholar whose research into his family history had been misinterpreted by a grieving widow, whose isolation and mental instability had created elaborate fantasies about persecution and assault. Dr. Whitmore is guilty of nothing more than loving his wife and trying to understand his family's past, Cross argued. Mrs. Harper's accusations are the tragic result of a mind unhinged by grief supported by selective interpretation of historical documents and coincidental circumstances. When I testified about Marcus's assault and confession, Cross attacked my credibility relentlessly. He suggested that I had been drinking heavily since Daniel's death, that I had made romantic advances toward Marcus that he had appropriately rejected, and that my accusations were motivated by jealousy and vindictive rage. Isn't it true, Mrs. Harper, that you resented your daughter's marriage from the beginning? Cross demanded during cross-examination. I had concerns about the age difference and some aspects of Marcus's personality. I replied, carefully remembering D.A. Morrison's coaching about staying calm under pressure. And then when your husband died, didn't those concerns intensify into active hostility toward the man who was taking your daughter away from you? No, that's not accurate. My concerns were based on, Mrs. Harper, you've admitted that you researched Dr. Whitmore's family history after his marriage to your daughter. Isn't that the behavior of someone looking for reasons to disapprove of her son-in-law? I researched his family history after he revealed his connection to people who had destroyed my family in the 1960s. I replied firmly. I was trying to understand why he had sought out Charlotte and what his real motives might be. Cross spent hours trying to poke holes in my testimony, but the physical evidence and medical documentation supported my account. More importantly, the materials found in Marcus's storage unit painted a clear picture of obsessive planning that no amount of legal misdirection could explain away. The turning point came when D.A. Morrison introduced Clara's journal as evidence. Reading those pages aloud in court with Charlotte listening from the gallery was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. Clara's words revealed the depth of her delusions and the systematic way she had indoctrinated Marcus with hatred for my family. Entry after entry described the crimes we had allegedly committed, the justice that needed to be served, and the specific ways that Marcus could position himself to exact revenge. Marcus is such a bright boy, one entry read. When he's older, he could find the Bennett girl and make her pay for what her family did to us. Marriage would give him access to their lives, the ability to hurt them in ways they would never see coming. Charlotte's gasp was audible throughout the courtroom as the implications of her grandmother-in-law's words became clear. For the first time since Marcus's arrest, I saw doubt flicker across her face as she began to understand that her marriage might not be what she had believed it to be. But the most dramatic moment came when D.A. Morrison called Dr. Sarah Wellington, a psychiatrist who had reviewed Clara's medical records and journal entries. Mrs. Whitmore was suffering from what we would now diagnose as delusional disorder. Dr. Wellington testified. She had constructed an elaborate fantasy about being wronged by the Mills family, but her delusions were based on a complete reversal of the actual historical facts. Can you explain that reversal? D.A. Morrison asked. Mrs. Whitmore's father, Theodore Reginald, was indeed responsible for driving the Mills family out of Ocean City through fraudulent business practices and deliberate sabotage. But Mrs. Whitmore could not accept her father's culpability, so she created an alternative narrative in which the Mills family were the aggressors and her family were innocent victims. And she passed this false narrative to her grandson, unsystematically and repeatedly from his early childhood through adolescence. She essentially programmed him to believe that seeking revenge against the Mills family was a moral obligation. Cross objected vigorously to this testimony, arguing that psychiatric evaluation of a dead woman was prejudicial and unreliable. But the judge allowed it to stand, ruling that Clara's mental state was relevant to understanding Marcus's motivations and actions. When Marcus finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed the full extent of his delusions. He spoke eloquently about his grandmother's suffering, about the family honor that needed to be restored, about the justice that my family owed his. "Clara raised me after my parents died," he said, his voice carrying conviction. That would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. "She taught me about right and wrong, about the importance of standing up for family, about making sure that people who hurt others face appropriate consequences." "And you believe Mrs. Harper's family hurt yours?" Cross asked, leading his client through carefully rehearsed responses. "I know they did. Clara told me the whole story, how Eleanor's father spread malicious lies about my great-grandfather, how those lies destroyed Theodore's reputation and cost him his business, how Clara spent her life trying to rebuild what the Mills family had torn down." "So when you married Charlotte Harper, you were seeking justice for your family?" "I was seeking understanding," Marcus replied, and for a moment his mask of academic reasonableness slipped to reveal the fanatic underneath. "I wanted Eleanor to understand what it felt like to lose everything, to have someone you trusted destroy your life from the inside." The courtroom was dead silent as Marcus continued, apparently unaware that he was confessing to exactly the crimes he was charged with. "Charlotte was never supposed to be hurt," he said, looking directly at my daughter for the first time during the trial. "She was just the means to get close to Eleanor, to position myself where I could make her pay for what her family did to mine." Charlotte's face went white, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. In that moment, she finally understood that her entire marriage had been a lie, that the man she loved had never loved her, but had only used her as a weapon against her own mother. "The assault on Mrs. Harper was your way of making her pay?" D.A. Morrison asked during cross-examination. "It was justice," Marcus replied with chilling calm. "She needed to understand what her family had cost mine, needed to experience the same helplessness and violation that Clara felt when the Mills family destroyed everything she held dear." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole. But even as the bailiffs led him away, his eyes remained fixed on me with undimmed hatred. "This doesn't end here, Eleanor," he said as he passed my seat. "Justice has many forms, and my family has a long memory." Outside the courthouse, Charlotte and I faced each other for the first time since Marcus's arrest. She looked older, worn down by months of defending a man who had never deserved her loyalty. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have believed you. I should have seen what he was. He fooled everyone's sweetheart," I replied, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. That's what made him so dangerous. But even as we held each other, I knew that the damage Marcus had inflicted on our family would take years to heal. He had stolen Charlotte's faith in her own judgment, poisoned her memories of their marriage, and left her questioning everything she thought she knew about love and trust. The ring that had sealed their engagement was returned to me as evidence after the trial, and I understood that it carried too much pain to keep. But before I disposed of it, I wanted to use it for one final purpose, to ensure that the true story of our family's history was preserved, and that no future generation would be corrupted by the lies that had created Marcus Whitmore. The months following Marcus's conviction were a time of slow healing and gradual reconstruction of the relationship between Charlotte and me. She had filed for divorce immediately after the trial, but the legal process was complicated by questions about Marcus's assets and the fraudulent activities that had funded his elaborate revenge scheme. More challenging than the legal complications was Charlotte's emotional recovery.
The revelation that her entire marriage had been built on deception had shattered her confidence in ways that went far beyond her relationship with Marcus. "How will I ever trust anyone again?" she asked me during one of our long conversations as we worked together to sort through the belongings she had shared with Marcus. If I could be so completely wrong about someone I lived with for 2 years, how can I trust my instincts about anything? It was a question I understood viscerally, having struggled with similar doubts after my own betrayal. But watching Charlotte wrestle with self-blame and paranoia made me realize that healing would require us to support each other rather than retreat into individual isolation. Marcus was exceptionally skilled at deception, I reminded her as we packed books and dishes into boxes destined for charity. He spent years studying our family, learning exactly what to say and do to earn our trust. The fact that he succeeded doesn't make you naive or stupid, it makes him a dangerous predator. Charlotte nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The damage Marcus had done went beyond the obvious trauma of his crimes. He had stolen her faith in her own perceptions, her confidence in her ability to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. It was during this period that Charlotte made a decision that would change both our lives. She wanted to leave Maryland entirely, to start over somewhere with no connections to Marcus or the painful memories he had created. "I can't stay here, Mama," she told me one evening as we sat in my kitchen, the same room where Marcus had drugged and assaulted me 9 months earlier. "Every place we go, every restaurant where we had dinner, every street we walked down together, it's all contaminated now." I understood her need to escape, though the thought of leaving the only area I had ever known filled me with anxiety. At 43, I would be starting over, not just emotionally, but practically rebuilding the small preserve business that provided my livelihood and learning to navigate new communities. But Charlotte's healing was more important than my comfort. If she needed a fresh start to recover from Marcus's betrayal, then I would find the courage to support her decision. We spent weeks researching possibilities, looking for places that offered both economic opportunities and the kind of community atmosphere where we could rebuild our sense of safety and belonging. Charleston, South Carolina, emerged as our top choice, a historic city with a thriving art scene and tourist industry that seemed perfect for both Charlotte's teaching career and my preserve business. The move took place in the summer of 1991, exactly 1 year after Marcus's assault. Loading our belongings into a rented truck felt like a ritual of purification, leaving behind not just a house, but the memories and associations that had made our old life impossible to continue. Charleston welcomed us with warm, weather-friendly people and opportunities that exceeded our hopes. Charlotte found work as a high school English teacher, while I began the process of re-establishing my preserve business in a market that appreciated artisanal foods and traditional crafts. The early months were challenging but healing. Everything was different: the climate, the accent, the pace of life, the architectural style, but different in ways that felt refreshing rather than alienating. We were creating new memories in places that held no associations with Marcus or his crimes. It was at the farmer's market that I first met Rebecca Chen, an older woman who sold handmade pottery, and immediately recognized the quality of my preserves. "Honey, these are exceptional," she declared after sampling my peach butter. "You're going to do very well here once people discover what you're offering." Rebecca became my guide to Charleston's artisan community, introducing me to other local food producers and craft artists who formed a supportive network for newcomers. Through her, I learned about the city's rhythms and traditions, its hidden gems, and unspoken social rules. More importantly, Rebecca's straightforward kindness helped me remember that not everyone had hidden agendas or secret resentments. Her genuine warmth and practical support gradually restored my faith in the possibility of honest human connections. Charlotte, meanwhile, was finding her own path to healing through her work with students. Teaching gave her a sense of purpose that helped counter the feelings of victimization that had consumed her in the immediate aftermath of Marcus's trial. "These kids remind me that most people are fundamentally decent,"
she told me after her first semester. They're not trying to manipulate or deceive, they're just trying to figure out how to navigate the world. It was during Charlotte's second year of teaching that she met James Patterson, a history teacher who had recently moved to Charleston from Virginia. Their relationship developed slowly, with Charlotte maintaining careful boundaries that reflected her hard-won wisdom about the dangers of trusting too quickly. When Charlotte finally brought James home to meet me, I was struck by how different he was from Marcus. Where Marcus had been polished and confident to the point of arrogance, James was quietly thoughtful, asking questions rather than making pronouncements. Where Marcus had dominated conversations, James listened more than he spoke, showing genuine interest in other people's perspectives. Most importantly, James's response to learning about Charlotte's previous marriage demonstrated a character that Marcus had only pretended to possess. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been," he said when Charlotte finally shared the basic facts of what had happened. "To discover that someone you trusted completely had been deceiving you from the beginning, it would be hard to ever feel safe in a relationship again." "It has been hard," Charlotte admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to trust my own judgment about people. Maybe being cautious isn't necessarily a bad thing," James replied thoughtfully. "Taking time to really know someone, building trust gradually, those aren't character flaws. They're signs of wisdom earned through experience." James's patience and willingness to earn Charlotte's trust slowly, rather than demanding it, immediately convinced me that he was fundamentally different from the man who had nearly destroyed our family. When they married in 1994, in a simple ceremony in my garden, I felt genuine joy rather than the anxiety that had plagued me during Charlotte's first wedding. My preserve business flourished in Charleston's tourist-friendly environment. I opened a small shop in the historic district, selling not just preserves, but also locally made crafts and baked goods. The shop became a gathering place for both tourists and locals, a spot where people could sample products while sharing stories and building connections. By the time Charlotte and James's first child was born in 1996, a daughter they named Rose after my mother, I felt like we had truly left the nightmare of Marcus Whitmore behind us. He was serving his sentence in a federal prison, and we had built new lives that bore no resemblance to the existence he had tried to destroy. But as I would discover decades later, evil has a persistence that transcends individual lives. The ring that would arrive at my house in 2025 was proof that Marcus's obsession with revenge had survived his imprisonment, that he had found ways to continue his campaign against our family even from behind bars. The package that would disrupt our hard-won peace 35 years later contained not just Clara's ring, but evidence that some hatreds are powerful enough to reach across generations, finding new vessels when old ones are no longer available. But it would also prove that love and truth are equally persistent, and that some stories, however dark their middle chapters, can still have triumphant endings. Now, as Charlotte sat across from me in my Charleston kitchen on this September afternoon in 2025, staring at the ring that had once symbolized her happiness and our family's greatest nightmare, I could see the fear and confusion in her eyes. "How is this possible, Mama?" she whispered, turning the ring over in her hands as if it might reveal its secrets. "Marcus died in prison 15 years ago. Who could have sent this?" The anonymous note lay between us on the table, its cryptic message about debts and remembrance feeling more ominous with each reading. I had spent the morning researching what I could find about Marcus's death and estate, trying to understand how his grandmother's ring had made its way back to our lives. "I think," I said carefully, "that someone else has taken up Marcus's cause. Someone who shares his family's distorted version of our history and believes we still owe them some kind of debt." Charlotte's face went pale as she processed the implications of what I was saying. "You mean there are other people who believe Clara's lies about what happened in Ocean City? Marcus wasn't raised in isolation, sweetheart. Clara had other family members, and Marcus must have shared his obsessions with them during the years he spent planning his revenge. When he died in prison, someone else inherited not just his belongings, but his hatred."
I showed Charlotte the research I had done, the genealogical records that revealed Clara's extended family tree. She had had siblings and cousins, people who had children and grandchildren of their own. Any of them could have been exposed to the family mythology about our supposed crimes against the Reginalds.
But why now?
Charlotte asked. Why wait 15 years after Marcus's death to make contact?
Maybe they needed time to locate us, I suggested. We changed our names when we moved to Charleston, built new lives under new identities. It might have taken years for someone to trace us here.
The thought that we had been hunted across decades, that our carefully constructed new lives had been penetrated by someone with Marcus's obsessive dedication to revenge, was terrifying. But it also sparked something in me that I hadn't felt since the trial, a fierce determination to protect my family from people who refused to accept the truth about their own history.
What do we do? Charlotte asked, and I could hear the echo of her younger self in the question the daughter who had once looked to me for guidance and protection.
We go to the police, I replied firmly. This is harassment at minimum, possibly stalking or criminal threatening. Someone is trying to intimidate us based on delusions that have already been thoroughly debunked in court. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Charleston Police Department was a professional woman in her 40s who listened to our story with careful attention, taking notes as we described the ring, the note, and the history behind Marcus's crimes.
This is definitely concerning, she agreed when we finished our account.
Even though the message doesn't contain explicit threats, the circumstances suggest that someone is monitoring your movements and has access to personal items from your past. That constitutes harassment under South Carolina law.
Detective Martinez began investigating immediately, starting with the package itself and working backward to identify its source. The Postal Service provided some leads. The package had been mailed from a facility in Baltimore, the same city where Marcus had lived during his marriage to Charlotte.
Someone is specifically connecting this to Marcus Whitmore's crimes, Detective Martinez observed. They want you to know that they're continuing his work, carrying on his campaign against your family. The investigation expanded as Detective Martinez contacted federal authorities who had handled Marcus's original case. What she learned added disturbing new dimensions to our understanding of the current threat. Marcus had not been isolated during his imprisonment. He had maintained correspondence with several people who shared his family's grievances against us, and he had apparently spent years recruiting others to his cause. His letters, which were now part of the federal record, revealed an extensive network of people who believed in his grandmother's version of events and supported his quest for revenge.
Your son-in-law was essentially running a conspiracy from his prison cell, Detective Martinez explained during one of our meetings. He convinced multiple people that your family had wronged his, and he gave them detailed information about your new lives in Charleston.
The revelation that Marcus had been orchestrating efforts against us even after his conviction was chilling, but it also provided law enforcement with specific leads to follow. The people he had been corresponding with were known quantities, their names and addresses part of the official record. Within a week, Detective Martinez had identified the most likely suspect, Patricia Reginald Foster, Clara's niece, who had been in regular contact with Marcus throughout his imprisonment and had apparently inherited both his possessions and his obsessions after his death. Patricia Foster lived in Baltimore in a house filled with Reginald family memorabilia and Marcus's conspiracy materials. When police searched her residence, they found extensive documentation of her efforts to locate and harass our family, including recent photographs of my shop and Charlotte's house that had clearly been taken without our knowledge.
She's been planning this for years, Detective Martinez told us after Foster's arrest. Marcus apparently convinced her that completing his revenge was her family duty, and she's been systematically gathering information about your lives while waiting for the right moment to make contact.
Foster's own writings seized during the search revealed the same kind of delusional thinking that had motivated Clara and Marcus. She genuinely believed that our family had destroyed hers, that we owed them compensation for decades of suffering, and that justice required us to experience the same kind of loss and humiliation that she imagined we had inflicted on her relatives. It's remarkable how consistent the delusions are across 3 generations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh,
a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Foster's writings, told us during the legal proceedings that followed. Each generation has passed down the same false narrative, embellishing it and intensifying it until it became a kind of religious obsession. Patricia Foster was charged with stalking harassment and criminal threatening. During her trial, the full scope of the Reginald family's multi-generational campaign against us was finally revealed to public scrutiny. The evidence showed that Clara's lies about Ocean City had infected her entire extended family, creating a mythology that had been carefully maintained and transmitted across decades. Marcus had not been an isolated fanatic, but part of a larger network of people who shared his delusions and supported his crimes. But the trial also demonstrated something else: that truth, however long suppressed, eventually emerges to challenge even the most persistent lies. The historical records that had vindicated my family during Marcus's trial were presented again, proving definitively that Theodore Reginald had been the aggressor in Ocean City, and that our family had been innocent victims of his greed and violence. Foster was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison with additional restraining orders that prohibited any member of her family from contacting us. But more importantly, the trial provided the closure that had been missing from our victory over Marcus. "It's finally over," Charlotte said as we left the courthouse after Foster's conviction. 3 generations of hatred based on lies, and now it's finally finished. I nodded, though part of me wondered whether hatred this persistent ever truly dies, or simply lies dormant, waiting for new vessels to carry it forward. But for now at least, our family was safe from the demons that had haunted us for so long. The ring that had started this final chapter of our ordeal was returned to us as evidence, and I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of destroying it, I donated it to the Ocean City Historical Society, along with all the documentation from our legal battles with the Reginald family. Future generations should know the true story. I explained to Charlotte when she questioned my decision. They should understand how lies can poison families across decades and how important it is to choose truth over comfortable mythology. As I sit in my garden in Charleston on this October evening in 2025, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I feel something I have not experienced in decades: complete peace. The ring has been returned to history where it belongs. The last of Marcus's conspirators is in prison, and our family is finally free from the shadows that have haunted us for so long. Charlotte is 67 now, recently retired from her position as a high school principal. Her marriage to James still strong after 30 years, built on honesty and mutual respect. She has healed from the trauma of her first marriage, though she retains the wisdom and caution that her experience with Marcus taught her. My preserve business continues to thrive under Charlotte's daughter Emma's management. Eleanor's Kitchen has become a Charleston institution with 3 locations and an online business that ships our products nationwide. What began as a simple way to support myself has grown into a legacy that will provide for future generations of our family. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren who visit my cottage represent hope for a future unburdened by the Reginald family's ancient grievances. They know the basic facts of our history, but to them, it's simply family lore rather than active trauma. They've grown up secure in the knowledge that they are loved and protected, that the adults in their lives have faced real dangers and emerged victorious. The story that began with a young woman's friendship with Clara Reginald in 1960s Ocean City has finally reached its conclusion. What I learned through decades of persecution and ultimate triumph is that truth, however long suppressed, has a power that transcends even the most carefully constructed lies. Clara Reginald chose to believe a false narrative about her father, rather than accept the evidence of his crimes. Marcus Whitmore built his entire adult life around seeking revenge for wrongs that existed only in his family's imagination. Patricia Foster wasted years of her own life nurturing hatred based on inherited delusions. Each generation had the opportunity to examine the evidence, to question the mythology they had inherited, to choose truth over comfortable lies. Each generation chose instead to pass the poison forward,
allowing hatred to consume their lives and threaten the innocent. But truth is persistent, and love is stronger than hate. Our family survived because we chose to support each other rather than retreat into isolation, because we insisted on evidence rather than accepting comfortable explanations, because we fought for justice even when it seemed impossible to achieve. The ring that Clara gave to Marcus, that Marcus used to ensnare my daughter, that Patricia Foster sent as a threat across the decades, that ring has finally lost its power to harm us. It sits now in a museum display, accompanied by documentation that tells the true story of what happened between our families. Future visitors to the Ocean City Historical Society will learn about Theodore Reginald's crimes, about Clara's mental illness, about Marcus's elaborate revenge scheme, and about how lies can poison families across generations when truth is sacrificed to pride and comfort. They will also learn about resilience, about the power of family bonds to overcome even the most determined enemies, and about how ordinary people can survive extraordinary challenges when they refuse to surrender to fear and hatred. My name is Eleanor Catherine Mills. I am 78 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that the past only has power over those who choose to remain prisoners of other people's lies. Some stories, however, dark their middle chapters, can still have triumphant endings when truth and love finally prevail over deception and hatred. The ring has returned to where it belongs, not as a symbol of power or revenge, but as a reminder of the importance of choosing truth over mythology, healing over hatred, and love over the seductive comfort of inherited grievances. As the stars emerge over Charleston Harbor and the sounds of my peaceful neighborhood settle into evening quiet, I offer a prayer of gratitude for the journey that brought me here. The shadows have finally lifted, the demons have been exorcised, and our family is free to write new chapters unburdened by the sins and delusions of previous generations. Some debts, it turns out, are never really owed, and some stories, when told with honesty and courage, can finally set everyone free.